Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the Theology of the Apostle Paul by Professor James Dunn. We're going to take a look at pages 128 to 138, and we're going to take a look at a very important lesson. We're going to take a look at the birth of systematic theology. The birth of systematic theology. I mean, when you think about this, 2,000 years ago, there was no systematic theology. It didn't exist. And Paul became the first genuine Christian theologian and integrated his various doctrines into a worldview that coincided with that theology and created the very first systematic theology. And the thing is, usually in systematic theology, you begin with theology, doctrine of God, then Christology, doctrine of Christ, then pneumatology, doctrine of the Spirit, and then ecclesiology, doctrine of the church, and then eschatology, doctrine of the last things. That's usually how systematic theology proceeds. Paul, however, we'll find in this lesson, Paul begins not with theology proper, he begins with anthropology. And he begins with a burning question, the question of righteousness. And he has that dilemma and that burning conviction after his conversion experience. And so his birth of systematic theology is unique in that it begins with the question of dikaiosune righteousness. We're going to look at that, but it is obviously a miracle from God. I mean, there was no such thing as systematic theology. Paul brings us systematic theology for the very first time in history, and he begins in Galatians with early formulations of his theology, and then 4 years after that, he becomes even more systematic in his Romans systematic theology. But it begins in Galatians and starts to take shape there. And then he builds on that for about 4 years and then writes Romans. And then we have his more mature, elevated systematic theology, truly formalized. But it begins in Galatians. But we're going to take a look at this. It gives us this lesson gives us a larger picture of Paul, and it gives us that look at the very first stages of the birth of systematic theology. To begin, we're actually going to go to block 3 first and look at the summary to the lesson, and then we'll go to 1 and 2. We're going to begin with block 3. Paul's newborn burning conviction that started his systematic theology, living under the law. Romans 2:12 and 13 is Paul's first mention of the nomos law in Romans. For as many as have sinned without the law, they shall perish without the law, but those who have sinned within the law, they shall be judged by the law. For the hearers of the law are not righteous before God, but the doers of the law shall be righteous. Here's what concerns Paul. The kaioi para ta theas. The kaioi para ta theas. Righteousness before God. How do we attain righteousness before God. As a Pharisee of the Pharisees, Paul thought he had the answer. After his conversion experience, he realized he did not have the answer. He wasn't even in close approximation of an answer at all. As a matter of fact, Paul had to enter the wilderness for 3 years. He had to enter Arabia, and he had to work out this burning new conviction, this burning new question that he had after his conversion of, okay, what does this mean now? Now that I've gone through this experience, what is righteousness before God? That becomes the conviction that starts the process of a newborn systematic theology. Pauline-Systematic-Theology. Righteousness before God. This is the concern that burned in Paul's heart after his conversion. He was on a journey to discovering the birth of a new relational righteousness, and he begins by comparing Jews and Gentiles, those inside and those outside the law, in Romans. In Romans chapter 2 is the first instance where we discover Paul's theological assertion that there is no longer a sense of Jewish privilege. That's the first conviction Paul comes up with. There is no longer a sense of Jewish privilege. In Romans 3:19, we find Paul's conclusion that every Jewish mouth must be stopped because all are equally guilty before God. So from Romans 2:12 to Romans 3:18, we discover Paul's new birth as a systematic theologian. And it begins with a burning new question, a burning new conviction. How does one live righteous before God? And for Paul, the answer was only through Christ-centered faith. This is what Paul discovered. This is the burning question and the burning conviction that entered him after his conversion experience. And it gave birth to the very first ever written systematic theology. It began in Galatians, and then 4 years later, it was formalized in Paul's letter to the Romans. But it began in his very first work, the letter to the Galatians. So Paul begins systematic theology not with a doctrine of God. He begins his systematic theology with a doctrine of man, anthropology, and the question of dikaioi paratheia. What does it mean to be righteous before God? And what Paul discovered is that righteousness now was relational righteousness. Relational righteousness through a recognition of Jesus as the Christ and living a Christ-centered faith. So that starts us on this journey. We began with block 3. Now let's go to block 1, and we can continue here on this lesson on the birth of the miraculous birth. It is a miracle. The miraculous birth of a systematic theology. Okay, let's go to block 1. Paul's systematic theology is given birth in Galatians, but reaches maturity 4 years later in the book of Romans. Paul's theology is born through examining the effectiveness of the law. Romans 7:7, I would not have experienced sin except through the law. Sin and death are enjoined to the law for Paul. Romans 5:20 and 21, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace abounded more. Sin reigned unto death. Grace reigned unto righteousness. Paul initially forms a negative attitude toward the law after his conversion. In 1 Corinthians 15:56, it is described as the sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. Romans 3:20, by the deeds of the law no flesh shall be justified, for by the law comes knowledge of sin. Also, we consider Romans 10:4, for Christ is the end of the law, for righteousness to everyone that believes. And here's the way it is written in Greek. Christ is the telos gar namu. Christ is the teleology, end of the law. Kai dikaiasune panti nu pistuanti. Christ provides righteousness unto anyone who is continually having faith. The participle is used there by Paul to emphasize continual life living of faith. Let's take a look at Block 1, Note 3. All right, Block 1, Note 3. All of the above were actually given birth in Paul's Galatians theology. We look at Galatians 2:19. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. Paul's theology begins with Galatians in AD 52, and Romans came around about 4 years later in AD 56. Galatians 4:8 through 10, Paul implies that to observe the law is to fall into the trap of the power of the Gnostic stoicheia, the Gnostic emanations. In Galatians 5:4, Paul says, Christ becomes of no effect unto you who are justified by the law, because you have fallen from grace. Again, Paul's newborn Galatians theology is essential for understanding his later developed Romans theology. Let's move on to Block 2 here, and let's take a look at Paul's theology begins with anthropology, the law, and the problem of righteousness. There you go. It doesn't begin with the doctrine of God. Paul's theology begins with the doctrine of man, the law, and the problem of righteousness. Exodus 24:7. And Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people, and they said, all that the Lord said we will do, and be obedient. For Paul, the Torah was a collection of ordinances and covenant obligations. The Hebrew Torah equaled the Aramaic law. So for Paul, the Namas law, Greek for law is Namas, the Namas law was a compilation of Israel's covenant obligations. The law is the measure of God's judgment. Romans 3:20. Through the law comes knowledge of sin. And then 5:13. Sin is not accounted in absence of the law. And then 7:13. Sin through the commandment becomes utterly sinful. Your key point. The idea of law as measure of judgment is not developed in Galatians. It was a developing characteristic of Paul's theology that became more final in Romans. In Romans, Paul expresses a mature systematic theology. The law as a measure of judgment is axiomatic truth. It needs no further defense or proof for Paul. Romans 3:19 through 20. Whatever the law says, it speaks to those under the law, that every protest might be stopped, for all the world becomes guilty under God. By the deeds of the law, no flesh is justified. The problem of righteousness is obviously evident there for Paul. This axiomatic truth was fundamental to Israel's understanding of the covenant. Fundamental for understanding covenant. But after Paul's conversion experience, righteousness could no longer be compliance to a list of ordinances. It became much more powerful and a much deeper understanding as a conviction of the heart. And Paul, after his conversion, discovered relational righteousness. No longer was it obedience to ordinances. Righteousness after conversion became relational righteousness through living relational communion of abiding in Christ. Righteousness meant abiding in Christ for Paul. Abiding in the life, the teachings, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Christ. Righteousness for Paul became relational righteousness after his conversion. And so his first letter was Galatians, and in Galatians he started shaping that theology. He started asking questions. We discovered in block 1, he started asking those questions about sin and death being enjoined to the law. But he also discovered that through Christ, even though sin abounded, grace abounded more. Sin reigned unto death. Grace through Christ reigned unto relational righteousness. So Galatians is where, well, first of all, Paul goes through the conversion experience on Damascus Road. Then he's left with a burning conviction and a burning question of what does it mean to be righteous before God? Because my life as a Pharisee of the Pharisees doesn't hold up anymore. It does not hold up after my encounter with Christ. So what does it mean now to be righteous before God? And that conviction and that question drove Paul into the wilderness.